Hello and welcome to Sunset Zen and Sleepy Stories. Please relax, listen, and enjoy. The House at Heron Inlet. A story for quiet nights. The rain had been falling since before anyone could remember, or so it seemed, in the way that Pacific Northwest rain has of settling in. Not dramatic, not insistent, just present. A soft gray companion that breathes against the windows and turns fir trees dark and lustrous and makes the whole world smell of soil and moss and something ancient and good. Maren's bed and breakfast sat at the end of a gravel lane on the edge of a tidal inlet, just south of a small town that most maps forgot to include. The house was old, cedar-sided with wide covered porches on three sides, and a roof so steeply pitched that the rain had worn little silver channels in the shingles. Wisteria climbed the eastern corner. A kitchen garden pressed itself against the south wall, sheltered from the worst of the storms. And around everything, on all sides, the forest. Hemlock and Douglas fir and the pale trunks of red alder growing up through sword ferns so green they almost glowed. There were 4 guest rooms, each named for something found along the shore. The sandpiper room, the kelp room, the driftwood room, the room with the heron lamp, which guests always called simply the heron room, because in it there sat on the bedside table a lamp whose shade was painted with a great blue heron standing motionless in still water. And when the lamp was on, the heron seemed to breathe. Maren herself was not easy to describe. She was somewhere in her 50s, or perhaps younger than she looked, or perhaps older. She had the unhurried quality of someone who had long ago stopped measuring time in the way others did. Her hair was the particular gray-brown of a weathered cedar plank. Her hands were capable, always doing something quiet and purposeful, chopping or kneading or tucking or tying. She spoke softly, listened carefully, and had a habit of pausing before she answered any question, as though consulting something just beyond hearing. People found her place, mostly, when they needed to. A travel website had once listed it, years back, but the listing had long since drifted down past the first several pages of results. The guests came anyway. They always did. On a Tuesday in November, a woman named Clare arrived in her car. It was too clean for the muddy lane. She was perhaps 40, and she had the drawn, careful look of someone who had recently held themselves together through something enormous and was only now beginning to notice the effort it had cost. She had a rolling suitcase, a laptop bag, and the particular stiffness of a person who could not remember the last time she had slept through the night. Maren met her on the porch. "You found it all right," she said, as though Clare had navigated something more difficult than an unpaved lane. "The GPS kept losing signal," Clare said, a little apologetically. "It does that," Maren smiled. "Come in out of the rain." Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and cardamom and something faintly herbal, dried lavender perhaps, or something from the garden that had no common name. A fire burned low in the stone hearth. Rain moved down the tall windows in slow, braided rivers. On the kitchen table, a teapot stood under a cloth cozy shaped like a sleeping cat "I put you in the Heron room," Maren said, taking Claire's coat and hanging it beside the door. "The bathtub in that room is very deep. I'll leave towels on the chair." She said it simply as a fact, not as a suggestion, and somehow this made it feel inevitable. Claire looked around the room, at the bookshelves with their soft, untidy spines, at the bundles of rosemary and dried rowan berries hanging from the low kitchen beam, at the bowl of late-season apples on the counter, each one imperfectly round and flushed with red, at the window where the inlet was just visible through the firs, gray and smooth and moving gently, the way water moves when it's thinking. Something in her shoulders, almost imperceptibly, dropped. Dinner that evening was simple. Maren set a single place at the long table, which might have felt lonely, but did not. A bowl of butternut squash soup, deeply orange with a swirl of cream and a scattering of toasted pepitas, and a single sage leaf fried crisp. A thick slice of bread that was dark and dense and tasted of rye and fennel seed. A small dish of butter into which Maren had pressed a sprig of fresh thyme so that it had infused softly over the course of the afternoon. Clare ate slowly, which she had not done in months. Outside, the rain intensified briefly. She could hear the downspout, a low, busy rushing, and then eased back into its usual murmur. When she had finished, Maren brought a cup of tea without being asked. It was a dark amber color, and it tasted of something between chamomile and something else, something woodsier, something that grew in shade. "What is this?" Clare asked. Maren considered for a moment. "Things from the garden, mostly. Lemon balm, a little oat straw, passion flower." She said it in the way one might read a list of birds spotted on a morning walk, not with any weight on the words, just naming what was there. Clare wrapped her hands around the cup. Outside, an owl called once from somewhere in the firs. The fire settled. In the days that followed, Clare fell into a rhythm that she did not plan and could not have predicted. She woke to the sound of rain and the smell of something baking, different each morning. Almond and pear, oatmeal with dried figs and a crust of brown sugar that cracked under her spoon, soft eggs from Maren's 4 hens, scrambled with chives from the garden, served on thick white plates that were slightly mismatched and had the weight of things that had been used for a long time. She walked each day, even in the rain. Maren kept a collection of rubber boots by the back door in various sizes, and a row of waxed canvas coats on heavy iron hooks, and she said nothing about whether Clare should go or where, just made it possible. The trail behind the house wound through a stand of old-growth hemlock, where the trees were so large that their trunks created their own weather, dry patches on the ground, columns of still air inside the general wet, and the sword ferns were enormous and prehistoric looking, and the nurse logs were covered in moss so thick and soft it looked like something dreamed. Clare walked until her mind stopped its narrating, until it went quiet and just looked. A Steller's jay, shouting, blew from a branch. A slug the color of old gold making its slow way across the hemlock root, the inlet through the trees, the water shifting between pewter and green depending on the light. A single great blue heron standing so still in the shallows that she walked quite close before it saw her, and then it rose, unhurried, trailing its legs, and became part of the sky. Each evening, Maren cooked, and Clare found herself drifting into the kitchen, drawn by the smell, and eventually Maren put a knife in her hand and a pile of leeks to clean, and Clare found herself chopping slowly while Maren moved around her kitchen in a quiet way. There was not always much conversation. Rain on the windows, the soft thud of the knife, the smell of garlic and warm oil. One evening Clare said, without really meaning to, "I'm not sure I know who I am anymore." Maren was stirring a pot of something with white beans and winter greens and ham hock she had put on that morning to simmer low all day. She did not stop stirring. She did not turn around. "That happens," she said finally, "when things come apart or when they end." Clare was quiet. "The not knowing is uncomfortable," Maren went on, her voice easy as though she were discussing the weather, which in a way she was. "But it's also just a season. The ground isn't empty when it's not growing anything. It's resting. It's changing in the dark." She lifted the lid from the pot, and the steam rose and curled, and the smell of it filled the kitchen. Thyme and slow-cooked beans and something savory and complete. And Clare felt, unexpectedly, like she might cry, and did not, and then felt something loosen in her chest that had been very tightly wound. By the fourth day, Clare slept 9 hours. She did not know this until she looked at her phone, which she had mostly stopped doing. 9 hours with no waking in the middle, no gray 3 a.m. arithmetic, no assembly of fears, just sleep, dark and uninterrupted, with the rain as a kind of lullaby that she had not known she needed. She came downstairs and told Maren, who was at the counter pressing butter into a piece of toast and not looking up. "Good," said Maren, and handed her the toast. On her last morning, Clare stood on the covered porch before breakfast and watched the inlet in the early light. The rain had slowed overnight and was now a mist, fine as breath that softened all the edges. A family of buffleheads bobbed near the opposite bank. The firs across the water were dark and enormous and perfectly still. A single kayak cut a clean line across the middle distance, someone out early moving quietly through the gray. She thought, "I will remember this exactly." And then she thought, "I don't need to remember it. I am different now in ways that will stay." Maren came out and stood beside her with a mug of coffee, not hers, Claire's, placed in her hand. They stood there for a while without talking, watching the mist move through the firs, listening to the drip from the eaves and the small sounds of the water, and somewhere out there in the gray, the lone clear call of a heron. "How do you do it?" Clare asked, and she was not sure exactly what she meant. Run a place like this, live in such quiet, make people feel so met. All of it, perhaps, any of it. Maren looked out at the water and was quiet for a moment, in her way. "I pay attention," she said, finally. "I think that's mostly what it is." Clare nodded. The mist moved through the hemlocks. The buffleheads dove and surfaced and dove again. The rain, just barely, still fell. And if you were to ask the guests of Heron Inlet, the tired ones, the grieving ones, the ones who had arrived in clean cars with too much luggage and tight places around their eyes, they would tell you different things. That the food was extraordinary, that the beds were the deepest they had ever slept in, that the trails were beautiful. And the rain had been peaceful, actually, once they had stopped resisting it. That the owner had said something one evening that they had been thinking about ever since. That they felt, on leaving, the way a field feels in early spring, emptied of last season's weight, ready, full of a particular kind of quiet potential. None of them could say precisely what had changed. None of them tried very hard to explain it. They simply went home a little differently than they had arrived, a little more like themselves, or a little more like who they might yet become. And the rain fell, and the herons stood in the shallows, and the firs were dark and still, and Maren's light was on in the kitchen window, and the lane wound back towards the road through the trees, and behind it all, the inlet breathed.